4,000 years before Shakespeare put quill to paper, a woman pressed a stylus into wet clay and signed her name. That name was Enheduanna, and it changed everything we thought we knew about why humans started writing. You'll see the moment Enheduanna's own hymn describes her being dragged from her temple and thrown into the desert like a criminal. You'll find out that her poems weren't just preserved, they were copied by students for over 500 years after her death. And you'll learn why the real question isn't who the first author was. It's how many first authors we've already lost forever. Imagine you're standing in a library. Not a modern one, ancient, massive. The shelves hold thousands of clay tablets stacked like bricks. Most of them are receipts, grain counts, tax records, lists of sheep. Writing was invented for bureaucracy, not beauty. That's the consensus. But then you pick up one tablet, and something is different. There's a name on it. Not a king's name stamped for authority. Not a scribe's mark. A voice claiming the words as hers. That name is Enheduanna, and she lived around 2285 BCE, give or take a few decades. That's not a typo. 2,285 years before the Common Era. She predates Homer by 1,500 years, Sappho by 1,600. When the Greek playwrights were just getting started, Enheduanna had already been dead for a millennium. So who was she? She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the man many historians consider the world's first empire builder. Sargon conquered the Sumerian city-states of Mesopotamia, roughly modern-day Iraq, and stitched them into something new. But conquest is easier than control. So Sargon made a political move that was frankly brilliant. He appointed his daughter as High Priestess of the Moon, god Nanna, in the city of Think of it like this. Enheduanna was a human bridge. Her Akkadian blood connected her to the conquerors. Her priestly role connected her to the conquered Sumerians. She was, in a very real sense, a piece of political architecture. But here's where it gets interesting. Enheduanna didn't just perform rituals and keep the peace. She wrote 42 hymns to temples across Sumer and Akkad, a collection scholars now call the Sumerian temple hymns, and 3 major devotional poems to Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and everything in between. These weren't just prayers, they were literature. They had structure, they had imagery, they had a perspective, her perspective. And at the end of one hymn, she wrote, and I'm paraphrasing the translation here, that the hymn singer was Enheduanna and that it had never been composed this way before. She knew she was doing something new. That's not a scribe copying a formula, that's an author staking a claim. Here's the part I can't get past. She didn't just write about gods in the abstract, she wrote about herself. In her poem called The Exaltation of Inanna, Enheduanna describes being violently removed from her priesthood. A rebel named Lugalana, some historians argue, he was a local ruler who rose against Akkadian control, seized and expelled her. She describes it in language that still hits hard after 4,000 years. She was made to flee like a swallow from a window. She wandered the thorns of the desert. She stood before the moon god Nanna and begged for intervention, and he didn't answer. She felt abandoned. She said so out loud in writing to the gods. That is not the voice of a bureaucrat tallying grain. That is a human being processing trauma through language. And then, and this is where the poem turns, Inanna answers. The goddess of war fights on Enheduanna's behalf. The rebel is defeated. Enheduanna is restored to her temple, and she ends the poem with a line that reads, in some translations, essentially as, "My lady has returned me to my place. The dawn has come." It's a complete narrative arc. Beginning, crisis, resolution, gratitude. She didn't just write a hymn, she wrote a story. Her story. Now, I want you to think about what had to happen for this to survive. Enheduanna died. Her tablets were buried. Empires rose and fell over them. thousands of years passed. And still, students in Sumerian schools were copying her hymns as part of their curriculum. For 5 centuries after her death, her work was required reading. That is how we know it, not because someone decided to preserve it for history, because teachers kept assigning it. She wasn't just the first named author, she was also, apparently, a good enough writer that nobody wanted to stop reading her. The physical evidence is startling in its directness. A limestone disc discovered at Ur in the 1920s, now in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, shows a figure conducting a ritual, and it's been identified by many scholars as Enheduanna herself. Her name is inscribed on the back. She is one of the few people from the ancient world for whom we have both literary and physical evidence at the same time. Most ancient figures give you one or the other, stories or objects. She gives you both. I keep coming back to one detail in all of this. We credit Sargon with building the first empire. His name is in every textbook. But Enheduanna may have been just as important to how that empire held together. She unified religious traditions across Akkad and Sumer through her temple hymns. She gave scattered city-states a shared devotional language. She used writing not just to record power, but to construct it. And she did it while simultaneously inventing what we now call authorship. So here's the question I've been sitting with since I started researching this. Enheduanna survived because she was royalty, because she was connected to an empire, because her work entered a school curriculum. She had every structural advantage a writer of her era could possibly have, and she still almost vanished. The tablets sat in the ground for millennia. Her disc was broken into pieces when it was found. The translations were contested. The dating was debated. She barely made it to us. So what about the writers who came before her? Because the evidence suggests writing was already centuries old by the time Enheduanna was born. Other people were pressing styluses into clay. Other people were shaping language. Some of them, almost certainly, were writing things that mattered to them personally. Were any of them signing their names? We don't know. The record doesn't show us. And the record, as I've said, is mostly grain counts. Enheduanna is a bridge between the ancient world and ours, between function and expression, between record-keeping and art. But bridges have 2 sides. We can see her side clearly now. We know her name, we've read her words, we've held her image. The other side of that bridge, everything before her, is still dark. How many writers are buried there unnamed? How many first authors did we lose before we thought to remember them? That question doesn't have an answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But Enheduanna kept asking questions that had no safe answers. I think we can do the same. Subscribe. There are more files where this one came from.